force majeure, also known as acts of God, earthquakes, volcanoes, avalanches, and droughts. Just to name some of the calamities that can befall, usually without warning. Then there are man-made catastrophes. The consequences of war spring rapidly to mind. Desperate Hours takes a hard-eyed look at some of the most dramatic disasters of the last 100 years. In this episode, you can run for cover, but you can't hide from the wild winds. That means hurricanes, cyclones, tornadoes, twisters, and typhoons. They are all pretty much different names for the same thing: powerful windstorms. Well, no, not necessarily. To simplify things, tornadoes and twisters both occur over land, while cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons form over the sea and mainly affect coastal regions, scattering as they move inland. The winds we'll be talking about on this show carry death, destruction, and heartbreak in their wake. We begin with the biggest blowout of this century, the hurricane they called Katrina. It was a tragedy on an enormous scale that left Louisiana, and indeed the entire United States, reeling in its aftermath.
The highest winds and highest storm surge are occurring now or have already occurred along the coast. Gradually will be subsiding later today.
Reaching wind speeds of up to 175 miles per hour, Katrina is ranked as the third most destructive tropical cyclone to make landfall in the US on record. The other two were the Labor Day hurricane of 1935 and Hurricane Camille in 1969. It is estimated that some 1,836 people died in the August 2005 hurricane and the ensuing floods. Millions more were rendered homeless along the Gulf Coast and in New Orleans, which was the site of the highest death toll.
It's all just torn up, everything.
This is about the worst one I've seen.
We're not used to seeing stuff like this.
There is a humanitarian crisis unfolding here in New Orleans. There are thousands of people trapped, running short of food and water, waiting for a bus out of here.
For the first time, the operation on these streets is changing from rescuing the living to recovering the dead. The problem is that most of the dead are either underneath this water or trapped in these houses. Now, until this floodwater is drained, they will remain there, the true death toll won't be known, and the floodwater may not be drained for several months.
America's party capital was badly flooded as the levee system failed in spectacular fashion. In some instances, hours after the storm had already moved inland. Approximately 80% of the city and many neighboring townships were flooded, with the floodwaters remaining for weeks to come. In terms of property damage, the worst of it occurred along a chain of Mississippi beachfront towns.
It just amazed me how it covered houses, cars moving down the street, just terrible.
I didn't think it would be as bad as it was, but it came through when tide was coming in. Our house got about a foot of water in it. Everything else around from our house down got about waist deep or higher.
Look at the destruction. Tore up. Anything else you'd like to add?
Many government officials came in for criticism after what was seen as a slow and slapdash response effort. Ray Nagin, the mayor of New Orleans, Kathleen Blanco, the governor of Louisiana, and US President George W. Bush were all lambasted. The president commented that New Orleans had dodged a bullet, yet this was after the White House was informed that the levees in New Orleans had broken and the city was flooding. Vice President Dick Cheney's office instructed a Mississippi electricity cooperative to restore power to a pipeline that sends oil and gas to the northeast. Doesn't sound so bad. Well, except for the fact that it delayed the restoration of power to 2 rural hospitals. For the survivors just trying to stay alive, or even just afloat, the situation must have seemed helpless at times. Officials at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration later declared that Katrina was the most destructive storm to ever strike the United States. The trauma was certainly real in Myanmar a few years after, when Cyclone Nargis struck. A cyclone is a tropical storm, specifically a violent, rotating windstorm. The word violent somehow doesn't suffice to describe the utter devastation caused by Nargis. Stands on record as the worst natural disaster ever recorded in Myanmar. Making landfall on Friday in May 2008, the destruction was almost incomprehensible. And the fatalities? Estimates vary, but even the most conservative, issued by the Myanmar government, put the death toll at over 84,000 people, with another 53,000 plus listed as missing. Some 37 townships suffered significant damage, with the UN estimating that as many as 2.4 million people were affected. With winds in excess of 120 miles per hour, Cyclone Nargis became one of Asia's deadliest storms by hitting land at one of the lowest points above sea level in Myanmar, triggering a storm surge that reached some 25 miles inland. Those on the ground didn't need to hear statistics. They knew they were in the midst of a tragedy on a profoundly epic scale. Natural disasters, with their random, indiscriminate brutality, are one thing, but mankind's response is another. And this was one time where politics made a tragic situation worse than it had to be.
We now estimate that 2 million people have faced famine or disease as a result of the lack of cooperation of the Burmese authorities. This is completely unacceptable. There must be unfettered access to humanitarian agencies.
The United States has made an initial aid contribution, but we want to do a lot more. We're prepared to move U.S. Navy assets to help find those who've lost their lives, to help find the missing, and to help stabilize the situation. But in order to do so, the military junta must allow our disaster assessment teams into the country.
As a result of the cyclone, the bulk of health facilities in affected areas were either completely destroyed or greatly damaged.
elements now to make us very, very worried. We've got massive displacement of people. We've got inadequate water supplies. We've got people living in flooded situations. We have very little sanitation there. We have people displaced and living in crowded centers or in schools.
But when the ruling military junta refused entry into Myanmar by Western humanitarian aid workers, the plight of survivors became still more desperate. With the response of aid agencies thwarted, it became all too clear that in the wake of disaster, humanitarian assistance can't come fast enough. Hurricanes usually have their origins in tropical regions. They form over warm ocean water around 26 degrees Celsius or 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And once they have gathered momentum, can be up to 600 miles across. They are comprised of strong winds spiraling inwards and upwards at up to 200 miles per hour. Hurricanes typically last for about a week, gathering heat and energy as they move over the warm ocean waters. Evaporation from the sea just serves to increase their power. The whirlwind revolves around its center, or the renowned eye of a hurricane. They twist and turn in anti-clockwise fashion in the northern hemisphere, but in a clockwise direction in the southern hemisphere. The center of the storm, or eye, is actually the tempest's calmest spot, where there are only light winds and generally fair weather. Yet once it makes landfall, the hurricane's heavy rain, strong winds, and large waves can cause devastation on an almost unimaginable scale. A tornado, on the other hand, is a rapidly spinning tube of air which touches both the ground and the clouds above. In the US, they are often referred to as twisters. The most violent tornadoes can attain wind speeds of up to 300 miles per hour. They can demolish large buildings, uproot trees, and pick up and hurl vehicles hundreds of feet away, as if they were mere playthings. The tornado's path of destruction can be anywhere in excess of 1 mile wide and some 50 miles long. 1,000 tornadoes are reported in the United States in a typical year. Fortunately, only 2% of these are labeled violent tornadoes. The majority of tornadoes form from thunderstorms. In the United States, for example, when warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico and cool, dry air from Canada meet, that's when the trouble begins. When these two air masses get together, they produce instability in the atmosphere. A change of wind direction and an increase in its speed creates a horizontal spinning effect in the lower atmosphere. Air rising within the resulting updraft tilts this rotating air column from horizontal to vertical. Tornadoes can occur at any time of the year, and no terrain is considered safe. That said, the US averages more tornadoes annually than any other country in the world. A world and time away from military juntas and political strife, the postcard picture-perfect Florida Keys. The setting for scenes of destruction, every bit as powerful as anything captured on film. That was the story when the winds whipped up to a Category 4 hurricane back in September 1960.
It swept over Florida with terrifying force. Rain fell in torrents, and the wind reached a velocity of more than 120 miles an hour.
When Hurricane Donna struck here, it had already caused death and destruction in Puerto Rico and other places in the Caribbean. As it lashed the Florida Keys, it repeated its vicious performance. The damage done was bound to run into millions of dollars. While Britain was basking in a few days of Indian summer, the east coast of the United States, including New York, suffered a trail of destruction as Donna continued on her ferocious course. Hurricane Donna had more serious consequences. This wild wind still holds the record for maintaining major hurricane status in the Atlantic Basin for the longest period, 9 days in total. Late in the afternoon on a Sunday in May 2011, the town of Joplin, Missouri was the stage for the kind of tornado that is capable of leveling whole neighborhoods in minutes.
Lost my house, lost my garage, lost my friend.
When they say that it sounds like a freight train coming, that's what I'd always heard, but I never. It is exactly what it sounds like, and the house was shaking.
Leveling suburbs in minutes is exactly what the Joplin tornado did. This town of 50,000 people lay directly in the path of the tornado, which was 3/4 of a mile wide at its worst. The tornado steamrolled over Joplin with winds in excess of 200 miles per hour, destroying more than 900 homes, killing over 150, cutting off telephones and electricity supplies, and knocking out a hospital. The destruction left behind a ravaged landscape that seemed surreal, almost alien. But there was another fascinating dimension to this natural disaster. With the town of Joplin known as the Buckle on the Bible Belt, many of the survivors claim to have had supernatural experiences. Both children and adults claim to have been protected by angels they call the butterfly people, or butterfly angels. These butterfly angels seemed real to some, and therapists did not try to dissuade believers. Their goal, as always, was to help people to process the trauma they'd experienced. So, whatever works. Why do violent hurricanes often have such safe, non-threatening sounding names? Katrina, for instance, or Hurricane Sandy, unofficially known as Superstorm Sandy. Sandy sounds like somebody's sister with freckles and a ponytail. But let's not be naive. Hurricane Sandy was the most lethal and devastating hurricane of the Atlantic hurricane season for 2012. Moreover, Sandy is listed as being, financially speaking, the second most costly hurricane in United States history. Sandy was formed in the Central Caribbean on October 22, 2012, and intensified into a hurricane as it traveled north through Jamaica, eastern Cuba, and the Bahamas.
Pasó sobre Jamaica con una intensidad de huracán categoría 1, con 130 kilómetros por hora de vientos máximos sostenidos y rachas de hasta 150, 160.
The storm is certainly it's still a hurricane for one thing, and it's now spinning just north of the Bahamas. And You can see from the satellite picture with Carolina up here and Florida here, it's becoming a very large storm system.
Hurricane Sandy is still about 200 miles off this coast, but you can feel her coming. Those waves have been measured at 35 feet just further out. Now, when that's combined with a high tide later and winds of around 80 miles an hour, they're going to carry those waves right over this boardwalk and smash into Long Island here.
When it made landfall in Cuba and the Caribbean, it did what you'd expect of any Category 1 hurricane. It left a path of destruction in its wake and was to blame for several fatalities. The beleaguered island nation of Haiti, still reeling from an earthquake earlier that year, suffered 51 casualties. But it was in New York and New Jersey where Sandy undoubtedly did the most damage of all. Concerned citizens and emergency services personnel had watched carefully as Sandy was reclassified as a tropical storm before strengthening again to a Category 1 hurricane. Informally, it became known as Superstorm Sandy. And when it finally hit the eastern seaboard on October 27th, no amount of precautions and preparations were going to stop it from wreaking havoc on an enormous scale, killing at least 117 people and leaving many, many more destitute and traumatized.
The beach might be up this street. They call it the city by the sea. Parts of it will soon be in the sea when high tide brings a huge surge of water. They're already getting out whatever way they can.
We stayed with my cousin last night. She has 5 kids of her own. I don't know what I'm gonna do. So we're here.
I'm trying to get some gas in my car. I'm getting out of the city. The city don't love me. I've been here my whole life. It's nothing. The ocean walked through my house, and I lost everything I own in 27 years, and I'm here 5 days and living in the street. I'm living in my car.
It's a lot worse than a few possessions, you know, because these can be replaced. But the community's been very helpful. You can see over there, all the organizations is giving food and blankets to everybody. So it's very heartwarming seeing the support of the community.
People think of hurricanes, they usually visualize a raging wind, swaying palm trees, and perhaps airborne debris. And while that does occur, that's not what takes people's lives. Water does. In fact, 90% of the fatalities in the United States due to hurricanes is due to water. Of course, most by drowning. Also want to emphasize that of that, 50% comes from storm surge.
We passed through the worst, you know. It's over us now, I guess, right?
In this episode of Desperate Hours, we have seen coastal regions ravaged by hurricanes. We have seen whole towns flattened by tornadoes. The only form of defense is to flee before they arrive or take cover. The force majeure has spoken. natural disasters, and man-made catastrophes. Events that can cause enormous loss of life, destruction, and hardship. In desperate hours, you'll become an eyewitness to some of the most noteworthy disasters of the last 100 years. This episode is bound to hit viewers where they live, which is really where we all live, inside our own bodies. Earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, volcanoes, and all the cataclysms that threaten human life. All of them are terrifying in their own way. But perhaps nothing is more chilling than the threat of disease, of epidemics. No other disaster feels more personal than something that literally gets under the skin. And in recent times, the threat of not merely an epidemic, but a pandemic, which could annihilate mankind, has somehow never seemed more real. But before we hit the panic button, let's brace ourselves by calmly and coolly examining the facts. Ebola. Humans and some primates are vulnerable to this disease, which is a particularly unpleasant one. Between a couple of days and 3 weeks after contracting the virus, its symptoms become all too clear, starting with fever, a sore throat, headaches, and muscle pains. But that's just a preview to the horror show that comes next. Vomiting, diarrhea and skin rashes, malfunctioning liver and kidneys, internal and external bleeding, including in some cases, blood leaking from the eyes. It gets worse still. Around 50% of recorded infections have resulted in death, around a week to 2.5 weeks after the symptoms of Ebola first appear.
Ebola, even just from the sound of the name Ebola, it's frightening, you know, it's scary.
And these people eventually end up dying. And some of them have had actually minor bleedings from their mouth.
People will think it's not a big deal, and then it will get out of hand again and continue to spread for weeks and months and years. And that's what we have to stop.
By the time people are dead with the Ebola, they are more infectious than all. So if they take care of their burial or their own, 10 more will be infected.
We might tend to think of Ebola as a recent development, but actually it was first identified in 1976 in a village near the Ebola River. The scientist who named the disease Ebola, one Peter Pyatt, is now director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Although he first identified the virus in a village named Yambuku, he decided to spare the little town the stigma. Thus, Ebola got its name. Since its detection, the disease has flared up several times. Between 1976 and 2013, the World Health Organization reported a total of 24 outbreaks, including 1,716 fatalities. Bad enough, you might think, but in 2014, things took a turn for the worse. In March of that year, the World Health Organization reported a major outbreak in the West African nation of Guinea. The disease quickly spread to Liberia and Sierra Leone, Guinea's closest neighbors. On August 8, 2014, the World Health Organization declared the epidemic an international public health emergency. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, described the situation in Liberia as catastrophic and deteriorating daily. Such was the fear and panic caused by Ebola, it actually kept people away from hospitals, leaving some patients with other conditions without proper treatment.
Well, the outbreak isn't contained, so collectively we're not doing enough yet.
which is not surprising since this is the first outbreak in West Africa, so the governments are not experienced in responding to this.
Their health facilities are completely overwhelmed. Poor countries, they weren't all that brilliant to start with. I'm not criticizing them, they're just not.
Panic and fear can be much more harmful than the disease itself. Maybe there will only be one case, but the harm that is produced by the fear on the economy, on people, may be bigger.
Still, in August of 2014, the disease spread to Nigeria, and one case was reported in Senegal. And on the 30th of September, the first confirmed case of Ebola in the United States ended 8 days later with the patient's death. On 29 December 2014, the first case was confirmed in the United Kingdom.
A high-level isolation ward at the Royal Free Hospital in North London has been on staff.
Even after 30 years, there is still much that is unknown about the disease. For example, although it is known that it is spread by direct contact with the blood or bodily fluid of an infected human or animal, there is still some doubt as to whether fruit bats are a regular carrier, apparently able to spread the virus without themselves being made sick by it. But advances are being made all the time, and diseases can be eradicated. After all, it's happened before. Take smallpox, which historians believe was with humankind since the first agricultural settlements about 10,000 BC. Mummified remains of Egyptian pharaohs contain the first definitive evidence of smallpox in the ancient world, though the first written accounts of the disease didn't appear until the 4th century AD in China. It rampaged through Europe in the Middle Ages, and later, in the 18th century, was said to be responsible for the deaths of 5 reigning monarchs. Characterized by blisters on the face, arms, and legs, the last case of smallpox in the US was back in 1949, and one other case was in Somalia in 1977. The WHO certified that smallpox had been eradicated in 1979. This was just 5 years after one of the most serious outbreaks of the 20th century. It happened in India between January and May 1974, where an estimated 15,000 people died, mainly in the states of Bihar, Orissa, and West Bengal. Of the survivors, thousands were left disfigured or blinded. Yet, as we said, by 1980, smallpox was certified as being eliminated by the World Health Organization, following their global smallpox eradication program.
The Somalia smallpox eradication program recorded the last case in Merka town, and it seemed to me that this was the last known case of smallpox in the world.
This was a big change for people in India and parts of Africa, where smallpox had long been considered a routine fact of life. However, it does seem at times as if the ingenuity of scientists and doctors is in a constant arms race against diseases that can mutate and take on a new form. Case in point, cholera. In straightforward terms, cholera is an acute intestinal infection caused by eating or drinking contaminated food or water. The time between infection and the first symptoms is sometimes less than 1 day. 5 days at the most. The symptoms are diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and unsurprisingly, severe dehydration. Without proper treatment, death can come on fast. Prevention is better than cure, But when treatment is really the only option, then the faster the better. Number one is rehydration. That's the replacement of lost body fluids using ORS, oral rehydration salts, namely salt and sugar mixed in with clean drinking water. Intravenous fluids and antibiotics all have their part to play in a cure. These are hardly luxury items, but when cholera strikes in a developing nation, they can be scarce commodities.
Once the bacteria does get into the water supply or gets into the food chain, it's very hard to contain without those basics, without the rehydration fluid and without clean water.
We know that, that over the last 12 months we've seen reported cases of about 19,000 outbreaks of cholera. We also know that over 1,000 people have died as a result of that.
The first recorded cholera pandemic ravaged the Bengal region of India beginning around 1816 and lasted some 7 years. Highly contagious, cholera spread to Southeast Asia, China, Japan, the Middle East, southern Russia, and around the world. Pandemic cholera outbreaks wreaked havoc throughout the 19th century. Ironically, the spread of cholera was helped by advances in technology, transport, and the mass movements of migration. However, it wasn't until 1854 before an Englishman named John Snow identified its primary cause as contaminated water. But from 1992 onwards, the so-called El Tor strain has been the dominant strain in all new cholera outbreaks. Testimony to the disease's ability to mutate and adapt. Since 2010, El Tor cholera outbreaks have occurred in places such as Haiti, South Sudan, Mexico, Pakistan, and Sierra Leone. In a world that has become as connected as the one we live in, how can mankind ever hope to stop the spread of disease? This is Heathrow Airport. On average, about 200,000 people arrive and depart from here every day. If just a handful of them are carrying a highly infectious disease, the potential consequences are, well, sobering to say the least. That's just a geopolitical reality. But what can you do to personally stay safe? Because as we all know, prevention is better than cure. The Mayo Clinic in the US recommends washing your hands regularly, staying at home if you do fall ill, getting vaccinated where appropriate, practicing safe sex and other common sense measures, like preparing your food hygienically. As for the proverbial big picture, as you can imagine, scientific researchers are always looking for new ways to stop illnesses from upgrading to epidemics. And never has this been more critical. As the publication Science Alert reported in December 2008, climate change, along with increasing populations, overuse of antibiotics, and global trade and travel can affect both the likelihood of a new disease emerging and the opportunity for diseases to spread to new populations. Dr. Julie Lynn Hall, who is a communicable diseases expert with the World Health Organization, has made the point that we are seeing the return of diseases like cholera and malaria, previously thought eradicated. But also, for the last 3 decades, the WHO has seen the emergence on average of 1 new communicable disease per year. And apparently, the incidence of new syndromes is on the rise. This is a global concern. So where do we look for answers to understand how diseases spread and how to contain them? The study of societal networks can help us understand how diseases can spread. The fact that diseases pass from one individual to another via certain types of contact, and that any given individual only has a limited number of contacts, is the starting point for this kind of statistical analysis. may sound a little abstract, but success in containing the spread of potential pandemics like SARS and avian bird flu suggests these studies are time well spent. While humanity still battles with maladies that have literally plagued us for centuries, new and deadly diseases have made themselves known in the new millennium. Notably SARS and bird or avian flu. Beginning with SARS, short for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. The disease was first reported in the Guangdong province of China. It is believed it was transferred to human beings from Chinese horseshoe bats and from a feline-looking mammal known as a civet, considered something of a delicacy in that region.
听说有的是没收嘛，那个你那主你那公安过来没收嘛，没收听他们说没收的火化嘛。
那当然怕啦，如果真正是有的这里面的，那怎么不怕？
Generally speaking, SARS begins with a high fever, temperatures higher than 38 degrees Celsius. Other symptoms include headaches, general discomfort, and bodily aches and pains. Mild respiratory symptoms at the outset, a dry cough, and in some cases diarrhea are all indicative. Most patients also develop pneumonia. However, no two cases of SARS are precisely the same. The disease can run rather different courses depending on a patient's age and level of fitness. A critical point seems to be around the third week, when the young and strong often start to improve. For the less fortunate, this is when the disease becomes more severe, when the lungs become clogged with fluid and debris, and more aggressive treatment is applied, such as mechanical ventilation. This is certainly not effective in all cases. Worldwide, the death rate from SARS seems to be about 10%. In 2003, the illness spread to more than 24 countries before it was contained. It's remarkable that the disease was effectively contained when you consider how easily it is spread, specifically by person-to-person contact when someone infected coughs or sneezes.
The situation we are facing now is an extremely serious situation. Never before in the whole world, the healthcare system has been put under such immense stress. Now over 200 nurses and doctors fell ill to this illness.
According to the WHO, some 8,098 people worldwide contracted SARS during the 2003 outbreak. Of these, 774 died from the disease. Tragic for all those people and their families, but things could have been worse, a lot worse. Once again, the WHO worked with governments of many nations and stemmed what could have been a global catastrophe. Avian influenza, known more informally as avian flu or bird flu, is an infectious virus that spreads among birds, and in some cases, human beings. Now, of course, most diseases that affect birds are not harmful to human beings. But two strains in particular have emerged in recent years that can be fatal. Even though these viruses are not thought to be transferred from one human to another, thousands of people have been infected since the first outbreak was detected in 1997, resulting in hundreds of fatalities. It was in that year, in China, that a strain of bird flu known as H5N1 laid waste to geese on a Chinese farm. The disease was found to have infected humans during poultry outbreaks in Hong Kong in 1997. 18 people were infected, 6 of whom died. It was unclear how the disease was being passed from birds to humans. Just the same, a mass culling of all poultry in Hong Kong may have prevented a global epidemic.
We have just started the chicken slaughtering operation in the Cheung Wan temporary poultry market. And we estimate that the number of birds to be slaughtered today will be in the range of some 40,000 birds.
想了想，这刚好现在是那个流感的病发期嘛。
如果而家係發現呢種菌咁啊，梗係唔食啦，暫時唔食啦。
医療防禦人員由於能力不高，技術條件比較差，不能及時的判斷和發現疫情。
For a time, it may have even looked as if H5N1 had been eradicated. But in December 2003, it was back. Reported first in South Korea, where it caused outbreaks in commercial poultry farms. In January 2004, severe respiratory illnesses in 11 children were reported in Hanoi, Vietnam, that was soon confirmed as H5N1 bird flu. By the end of the month, there had been more than 400 outbreaks in Vietnam. The disease was then detected on a Japanese poultry farm in Kyoto. By the end of January, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia and China reported outbreaks in poultry, and in Thailand, 2 more human cases were confirmed. No strain of avian influenza had ever infected as many countries all at once. Thailand and Vietnam recorded a total of 35 human cases, 24 of which ended in death. It soon became apparent that despite all the efforts to control the virus, it had become endemic, which is to say, permanently present in parts of Asia. Migratory birds and possibly the poultry trade have since spread the virus to over 40 countries. What's more, the virus is now genetically different to the one first detected in Hong Kong in 1997. The current strain, known as the Z strain, has been shown to be more pathogenic, capable of infecting an expanding range of animals, including pigs, as well as cats and dogs. So are we fighting a losing battle against a global killer?
The longer the virus is circulating in animals, including chickens and ducks, the greater the risk of human cases, and consequently, the higher the risk of a pandemic virus.
Well, in all scenarios, we take into account that up to 30% of the population might get sick over a 15-week period.
Yes, it's a very difficult matter. Eradication will come in many years. It's a matter of many years.
Ebola and cholera in Africa, SARS and bird flu, principally in Asia. All of them diseases with frightening potential to go global in a flash. Smallpox we seem to have defeated, but that's what was thought about cholera just a few years back. If we as a species are to endure, we have to be ever vigilant as individuals. Don't forget to wash your hands before you handle food, for example. But we must also be able to act collectively against the spread of disease. Because when the enemy are literally germs, it's well to remember epidemics don't recognize territorial borders.